While reading up on Frederick the Great, I came across very interesting discussions by various authors on the term of limited war or limited warfare. Some people make a distinction here, which is rather important, as we'll later find out. And so the 18th century is usually considered this, or named this, limited war, limited warfare. Now this comes to a certain degree, for instance, from Clausewitz, who notes there were limited goals in this age and battles were only fought when necessary. Whereas he looked mostly at Napoleonic warfare, which was due to Levian mass, to mass conscription and everything, way more overblown in comparison to the 18th century. The problem is you compare something from a different age and there was definitely various changes. While others note that it was around more courtesy. So courtesy was basically back then more the norm than the exception. This is of course especially in relation to the 30 Years' War of the 17th century, where basically everyone rode around and pillaged everything. So under the mercenaries and everything. So there are various views on this. Now basically some authors note that the methods of war were limited, yet the war itself was not. So here Browning makes a clear distinction between war and warfare, and he notes as an example that the 7 Years' War, which is considered by some the first global war, was definitely not limited. There was fighting in various places all over the world, but the war itself was not limited, but the limits of how you could make war. The problem is here, every war is limited by the necessities of its time. Nowadays, if you compare the losses we sustain now in wars, is basically if you compare to the Second or First World War, it's completely different. Now thousands of deaths are a huge issue, whereas back then those were the daily losses for several months, or 10 times those losses on a daily basis, which we have now in a complete war. And as different production capabilities, different infrastructure, conscription, population sizes. So every time is basically limited by its methods of wars. So some argue that it was a time of limited war and that battles were only fought when necessary because it was very expensive to train troops. For instance, some argue it's around 3 years of training. For infantry it's less, but for cavalry it's definitely more if you lose one soldier. So that there was very careful deployment so that you don't fight a battle unless it's necessary, as Clausewitz argues. The problem is, if you look at the number of battles that were fought in this age, it's pretty long. And also some other arguments against limited warfare is basically you have casualty rates from 30 to 40% sometimes. So if it was that limited, you wouldn't have these casualty rates. So the argument of irreplaceable manpower due to training doesn't make sense at all if you look at the number of battles and the huge losses sustained in those battles. So calling it a limited war, or even limited warfare, it basically both makes very little sense. Because the methods of warfare were limited, but those are always limited due to industry, demographics or other aspects. So, but so far I haven't seen anyone propose a different terminology. And we have to look forward on what is there. So basically mostly are judging by standards from different ages. Now, let's take a closer look at the limits of the 18th century we have. Basically conscription is limited. This is due to many issues. For instance, basically the population was rather unhealthy and used to physical labor. So malnutrition and hard physical labor usually doesn't lead to very healthy people. Additionally, the tax system and the administrative system was under quite some development and still rather fragile and not very well. Then there are limited road networks and the armies were still growing in size. So you have this problem that there were limited roads and they're of bad quality, and you have large armies, so you need a lot of supplies, which also means that forts and fortresses are very important because they can block off major choke points in a short amount of time. And since sieges were also very costly, because you needed specialized troops, specialized engineers corps, which the Austrians, Prussians and Russians usually don't had. And also you need quite a lot of material to do a proper siege, and it takes a lot of time. So time in the field with the army is expensive. You have to pay more, you have to bring in the supplies, you have bad roads and everything. So yeah, this puts a strong limit. Then at the same time, siege guns are very expensive and also move rather slowly. But you need to supply ammo, you need to supply uniforms and food, and at this point, food conservation and also preparation was very limited. So it slowed everything down. Then the soldiers were, unlike during the Napoleonic times and later on, less bound by nationalism or a higher call. For instance, in the beginning it was for the French Revolution. They were basically, I would call them contractors. They were not mercenaries like in the 30 Years' War, because then it turned out, okay, mercenaries, well, as much as a standing army cost for a state, mercenaries are worse, because they destroy everything and they turn against you once the dime is not rolling. So you could say that the soldiers were bound somewhere between mercenaries and the soldier we have now in more modern times. The call of duty and the loyalty is different. It's not simply only to the coin, but it's also not necessarily completely on the monarch or the nation or country or whatever form of identification you use here. So one author notes basically if the food didn't come in or the pay, then this could be seen as a breach of contract, and more or less it was still desertion, but it was justified for the soldier to a certain degree. So at the same time, since various aspects are rather limited, the army still fights with basically high technology, flintlocks. So you need proper training and discipline to use those flintlocks and also to supply them. Because, of course, the rate of fire is a joke compared to modern infantry weapons, but back then it was still a lot of firing. For cavalry, we have now, this is different to medieval times, or strongly different. Timing was now very important. Previously, to a certain degree, cavalry could very much be deployed with, let's say, less cautiously and still be a major change in battle. But now your timing had to be perfect, or your cavalry basically got slaughtered in the process. And the artillery branch was still very technical, but also they were rather looked down upon. And of course, supplies were rather important here. And another aspect is, of course, for the whole military system, optimization was limited due to the fact that officers mainly came from the aristocracy and they were rather independent from pay and everything. So you can't enforce a strong hierarchical structure here, and there are other values and other aspects to consider. So you can't strictly optimize here and say, okay, you're bad, let's go. I mean, some certainly did it, but in some cases you were still bound to a certain degree by those limits of the time. So this also means that defeating an enemy army was usually possible, but usually the final stroke to completely destroy it, or to completely destroy the army before it could retreat, was often not possible. So the army would retreat, reorganize, and could fight another day. So if it was not done very quickly, both sides faced attrition, and so you could say you could win usually several battles, but you couldn't decisively defeat the enemy, which is also in relation to Napoleonic warfare, where Napoleon often used his cavalry to finish off the enemy in a pursuing campaign. And after the invasion of Russia, since he lost so many horses and cavalrymen, he couldn't exploit some of his victories in the battles afterwards and finish off several enemies. You have a similar situation here, that you couldn't finish off the enemy. So a war prolonged necessarily because nobody could achieve a complete dominance over the enemy. And yeah, if a war prolongs, it costs money, which is not supported by the economy and not supported by the tax system and everything. So in this sense, the war was still limited, or in this sense, the warfare was still limited because the means were reduced. But again, this is something we also, tax inefficiencies, corruption is still a thing nowadays. So to apply this to the whole age of limited warfare or limited war doesn't properly add up, I think. So let's see if there's a new term out there and if it will catch traction. Now to summarize, it's basically an age of transition. If you look at the 30 Years' War, you have mainly mercenaries. And if you look afterwards at Napoleonic warfare and later on, you have national armies. So the soldiers are bound usually to national or political motivation, whereas in the 30 Years' War, they were basically only motivated or bound to the coin. Whereas in the 18th century, it's somewhere in between. You still have, in a way, you have, I would say, restricted or very disciplined mercenaries that also have a certain loyalty, which is beyond the coin and is also focused to a certain degree on the monarch and sometimes maybe also on the country or their units. So this is kind of this transition. Additionally, the armies are more professional and less large than during the Napoleonic warfare. And in comparison to the 30 Years' Wars, they're very disciplined, way more disciplined and way more under control. So they don't roam around and plunder everyone and everything that comes across. So this, I don't know if this makes kind of sense that you call it the age of transition, but again, the problem is there's a transition in every age probably as well to the next one. So this is also probably not the best name. I don't know. Hopefully there's a better name out there which makes more sense. Anyway, thank you for watching and see you next time.